This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Hey, it's good to be with you again on our 77th episode of the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. I'm joined, as always, by the man whose name is on the podcast.
I can't believe we've done that many.
I know. Time has flown by, and we're both a couple of hacking lungs today.
That's right.
We're both a little under the weather. We've both been traveling recently, and so just bear with us if you hear some coughing and sniffling.
Yeah, you just got back from Europe, and
I did.
got back from Canada.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You were just in Toronto. More on that later.
Yeah.
But something we haven't done on the show before, but we wanted to do today because this episode will air on Tuesday, and if you follow,
not just any Tuesday,
but Giving Tuesday. It's the Tuesday after Thanksgiving and Black Friday, Cyber Monday, and they always make an emphasis for Giving Tuesday to support the organizations that you care about, and we hope that you care about this organization and this podcast. We haven't done anything like this before, but we just want to say, if this podcast has helped you become a better leader in any way, would you consider supporting what we do here? We are a nonprofit. As we mentioned at the top, this is part of Blackaby Ministries International, which is a 501c3. And if this is something that has blessed you, has helped you in any way, just consider giving some.
We don't talk much about this, but this is a ministry, and we actually couldn't function literally without donations and support. And as we get to the end of the year, we're actually behind on budget this year, and so we actually really need some folks, if they just feel led, to step up and make a donation, and very much appreciated. We'll of course give you a donation receipt, and but we've had such a great year as a ministry. We've done so many things, but even just doing this, it requires a studio, a place to do this, and equipment, and
time. It takes my time. It takes your time.
And so, if you would, I tell you what, we really, truly, honestly appreciate it, and we do things as low budget as we can, and still have quality. So we certainly don't waste the money. But sometimes people don't realize. They think I've had people say, "Oh, well, has an experience in God, sold millions of copies," and unfortunately, my dad didn't earn royalties on the first 7 or so million of those, and so it's not that the ministry is flush with funds. We actually really rely upon donations. So if you feel led to do that, and you just appreciate the ministry of this podcast and other things that we do, then we really appreciate it, and actually really could use it this year.
Right, and we will leave links where you can give online in the show notes, so be sure to check that out if you feel so led. And also, we've recently published all of our episodes on our YouTube channel. If you just search Blackaby Ministries on YouTube, you can find the YouTube channel, and it's just the audio. We haven't started filming these yet. We may, but we'll just stay tuned.
We'll have to clean ourselves up a bit more if we're going to do that.
I'll have to start shaving, so that's unlikely to ever happen. But those, they're also there on YouTube now, so you can share those with your friends, and it's just another way to get the material that we do here. So, with all that out of the way, today we're doing a fan favorite segment of the podcast, which is a leader profile. And we're doing a profile on a man who probably needs no introduction. And he even has a company named after himself. Who are we talking about today, Richard?
Well, we're going to look at Henry Ford today. And I've got a biography by Stephen Watts called The People's Tycoon that I'll base it on. There's lots of biographies on.
That sounds like an oxymoron, The People's Tycoon.
Yeah, well, it is. And in many ways, he was something of a paradox of being perhaps certainly one of the wealthiest people in America and in the world, and yet being seen and identified with quite often by just the ordinary working person. Ford grew up on a farm in Michigan, I think around Dearborn, and he had some difficulty growing up. I mean, he had a good life as far as growing up on a farm, but there's a lot of. It was interesting reading this biography because the biographer said that in a lot of ways Ford built his own mystique. He kind of created his own myth about himself. And so you have to kind of wade through sometimes what Ford said about himself to get to the truth. He kind of liked a certain picture of himself as a farm boy with a very demanding, aloof father figure. His dad was quite strict and tough, but sometimes it sounds like Ford maybe made him sound harsher than he really was. His mother was doting and loving, but she died in childbirth, and so it was a very traumatic experience for Ford. People said, the biographers and people that he interviewed early on said that Ford growing up wasn't lazy, but he just never really liked farming, and so he always liked machines. And in fact, when he was just a kid, he would tinker with watches and actually would fix watches. People in the surrounding area would bring their clocks and watches and things, and he just loved tinkering and fixing things. And so he'd go out and he'd work on the farm for a while in the morning, and then the first chance he got, he'd escape and go exploring. And something you kind of see about Ford really his whole life is that he was a free spirit. He didn't really like being told what to do. And even when he got his first couple of jobs, he would master his work. He'd figure things out. He was always intrigued by machinery and how things worked. So he'd become good at what he did. But then he might come in late, or he might goof off some. And he was always a practical joker. Loved to do all kinds of practical jokes on people. And so he'd goof around some, but then when you needed him to do the hard things and solve the hard problems, he could do that. So, but he sort of cultivated the myth of a tough childhood and had to kind of go out on his own and get a job. And one thing they did say too, that in his biography that I thought was interesting, was he hated horses. He didn't like riding them. Of course, had to work with them on a farm. In fact, the biographer said that perhaps one of the reasons he was driven so much to make cars was because he hated horses. And sometimes it's almost interesting when you go back and you look at kind of the motivators for people, the kind of, what drove them to ultimately do what they did.
No pun intended.
Yeah. I make puns even when I'm not even trying.
I know. It's a disease.
It's just I call it a spiritual gift.
Oh,
but,
yeah.
Lots of things to say about Ford. He began experimenting with cars. He actually worked for the Edison company early on and became friends with Thomas Edison. Ended up going on vacations with Edison for years afterward. But he just had a gift for that. And the one of the paradoxes about Ford is that there are people who are really good at certain things, and then we mistakenly begin to assume that then that makes them experts on all things. And so if you've become fabulously wealthy because you know how to make cars, then we think that, and Ford began to think later on that he then just was an expert on human living and morals and education and world peace and economy and all kinds of other things. And that's a mistake I think we still make to this day.
Yeah, you see that in a lot of areas. I think especially with pop culture icons.
Yeah, because you play and you're an actor or you're a rapper. Now you can comment on all kinds of social issues and economic and legal issues, and of course that's it's like the joke about people that play a doctor on TV, and so they're giving medical advice for real. I suppose the thing that Ford did ultimately was, when he invented the Model T car, it revolutionized America, and in many ways. And he had a falling out early on. A famous story, one of his chief backers financially was Alexander Malcolmson. And Malcolmson was really pushing to build cars that were higher-end cars, cars for the wealthy. that would have a higher profit margin. And Ford really wanted to make cars that the average person could afford. And back then, when Ford was making those cars, the majority of Americans still ride horses and buggies. And Ford and cars are viewed as only for the rich.
Yeah.
It's interesting, as someone has said, back in his day, wealthy people drove cars. The average person rode horses.
Mm-hmm.
In our day, everybody has a car. Only the wealthy can afford a horse. But things have changed now. But Ford won out over Malcolmson. Malcolmson ultimately left the company, interestingly enough, sold his shares for $175,000 and started his own car company so he could do it the right way. Within 2 years, his car company has gone bankrupt. And if he just held on to that $175,000 worth of shares in Ford Motor Company, within 10 years, they would have been worth hundreds of millions of dollars. One of the worst financial blunders in American history. But Ford decides, I want to make them cheap enough that the average American can afford one. And a lot of people say that really Ford introduced really consumerism to Americans. Before, people were just kind of getting by. But when Americans realized, no, they could actually purchase luxury goods, in a sense, then all of a sudden they began to look at other luxury goods. And, of course, before the car, you didn't need paved roads. You didn't need gas stations. You didn't need a garage built onto your house. All of a sudden, road signs and all kinds of things begin to blossom all over America as the average working person realizes, no, it's not just the wealthy people that get to have consumer goods, but I can too.
Yeah.
And so Ford, of course, he developed the assembly line. And he said, instead of people moving from station to station, I want people to remain stationary and have the product, the car, moving along an assembly line. And through a series of ever more modern factories, Ford is credited really with developing the assembly line. And one other thing that he ultimately did was, which seems so crazy to us, but in around 1913 or so, he decides to pay all of his workers $5 a day, which was more than twice what people typically earned in a day. And so $5 a day at that time, that's $25 a week. Some people weren't even making $25 a month. All of a sudden, Ford Motor Company was where everybody wanted to work.
Right.
And part of what Ford said was, I don't want to just hoard all the wealth myself or to my investors. I want my workers to share in the wealth and to be able to. His attitude was, hey, we pay, if we've got 16,000 workers at our factory, and they all are getting paid well enough, they'll all be able to buy cars. It'll help. As people have more money to spend, they'll spend it on our product and on other products. And of course, it caused a lot of other companies to become very upset because now they got to keep up. If Ford can afford to pay $5 a day, why can't you? And so it helped to raise overall the wages for Americans, and in just many ways it revolutionized America.
Yeah.
And of course it made Ford appear to be, as the title of that book is, the people's tycoon, because he became very wealthy, but the average working man could identify with him. And even his car was not, the Model T was not fancy. There were other car makers that made more fancy cars, but the average person could afford one of them. And they were built rugged enough that they'd go anywhere. And so Ford became, there were other people before him like Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan and Carnegie and others that had made massive fortunes as well. But they were known as the robber barons of the Gilded Age. They became very wealthy, but everybody looked upon them suspiciously, like they had done it dishonestly or crassly in some way. But Ford, he did it in such a way that he raised up all of his employees with him and made them all earn a good living as well. And he did a number of things. He actually had a more enlightened outlook on hiring African Americans and paying them a good wage. He also he was responsible for bringing a lot of Muslims over from other parts of the world to work in his factories, and so today there's a large Muslim population that traces itself back to coming over to immigrants working for the Ford company. I have a good friend that his father was deaf, and Ford helped sponsor a school for deaf people and hearing impaired people, and basically said, if you guys will finish school, I'll hire you at the Ford company. And my friend's father took Ford seriously and did end up becoming a draftsman and got a job at the Ford company. And so in many ways, Ford was seen as very enlightened. Interestingly, Lenin in Russia and then later Hitler both really admired Ford, which is not necessarily a compliment.
No.
In fact, Hitler actually gave Ford a medal, the highest medal that Germany gave to civilians for his work in mass production, which is something Hitler was interested in.
Obviously.
And efficiency.
Yeah.
And so in many, many ways, Ford was, he embodied the American spirit. Of course, coming in the early 1900s, really the 20s is when Ford really hit his peak. And at one point, his factory was producing about half of all the cars made in America. And it's interesting because at the turn of the century, there were over 500 companies making vehicles. And,
which is crazy. Like that.
Yeah.
That's a staggering number of car companies.
It is. And, like a lot of the ones that eventually merged, like Dodge and Chrysler and Plymouth and, so many Cadillac, all these different companies, they eventually all were bought out and merged into bigger companies. But in the early days, they were all separate companies. And yet Ford really managed to rise above them all. And brilliantly, in many ways, he had just an instinct for that. One thing he ultimately did was just to gain control of his own company, buy out the smaller investors, so that he could do what he wanted. And he didn't really like people telling him what to do. And of course, he played up on that. And at times he got a real taste for advertising and publicity, and he liked to be seen as the people's tycoon that cared about people. And he got into a big debate at one point with the Dodge brothers. The Dodges actually owned, they helped invest originally in the Ford Motor Company, which is interesting.
Yeah.
But Ford began to be making millions of dollars of profits every year. And he had accumulated at one point over $50 million in assets just in a financial reserve. Ford kept trying to build the company bigger and to keep costs down in production. And the Dodges were like, hey, we invested in this company.
Yeah,
we want
our dividend.
We want dividends. We want to get paid. Why are you piling up millions of dollars in the bank instead of paying it to your investors? And Ford ultimately got into a big battle legally over that because there was just two very different viewpoints. Ford said investors, they don't really, they put their money up front, which is important, but then after that they don't do anything. They just, once they've invested their money, they just sit back and take all these profits, but they're not really contributing value. They don't work at the plant. They don't make any difference really, except at the outset. And he said the money should really be going to the workers who are doing the work and so on. And so two very different viewpoints that made him for a time at least, seem very, very enlightened.
Yeah. Well, I think this is a good place to take a quick break, and we'll see what else Ford had to say and do afterwards.
Whether at home, on the job, or in the ministry, we can all have a greater impact on the world around us for the kingdom of God. Join Richard Blackaby at the Billy Graham Training Center at the Cove to learn about increasing your spiritual influence on April 6th through the 8th, 2020. Space is limited, so register soon at the link in the show notes.
Well, as you heard there in the break, we've got a unique opportunity for those listening to attend a conference at the Cove, Billy Graham's Training Center in Asheville. Richard, could you tell us a little bit?
Yeah, if you've never been to the Cove,
that?
It's a beautiful, beautiful place.
It is.
Billy Graham set it up. He knew the area. He lived not too far from there. And he just really wanted a place people could get away and just have a spiritual retreat.
Yeah.
He wanted good Bible teaching, and then he just wanted a beautiful location, beautiful facility, great food. And so it's just, if you fly into Asheville, North Carolina, it's quite near there.
Mm-hmm.
In the Blue Ridge Mountains.
Beautiful.
Yeah, there's a beautiful deck, and you look right out on the mountains. Actually, the Vanderbilts, William Vanderbilt built his famous Biltmore House, basically with the same similar view, looking out on the Blue Ridge Mountains. Mm-hmm. He couldn't find a more beautiful place himself to build his mansion. So, but we're going to be talking about how God increases your influence, and I think that's just something that every Christian needs to be asking. This is a time we need to make as much difference as we possibly can.
Right.
And so whether it's in your church, I've had people say, well, I'm not the pastor, I'm just a lay person. I see some issues in my church. I know there's some things we're not doing like we should, but what can I do? And I would say, well, you can have a greater influence for good. If God's put something on your heart, I hear people say, well, our church doesn't pray, or church doesn't evangelize, or church doesn't do this or that. How could God use you to make a difference? And then certainly how God makes a difference with your life on the younger generation.
Right.
So many of us are concerned about the Gen Z, millennials, and yet how could God use your life to have a greater impact on your own kids and grandkids, and then on others, and then on culture as well? We look at culture as quite a hostile aspect right now in American society, and yet instead of just seeing it as how do we protect ourselves from culture, we need to be asking, how as Christians can we impact culture for good? And so my son Daniel, who does all the work on our Collision website here at BMI, is going to be there as well, talking about culture and the younger generation, and I'll also be talking about God's influence he can give you in the marketplace. And so really important topics that I think all of us can relate to in one way or another. And so if you've never been there, be sure to come and let us know. Send a message, and we'll have a number of meal times as well at the Cove. They've got an incredible dining room with wonderful food, and we'll typically, if we've got friends and people who perhaps listen in, if you let us know, we'll share a meal with you while we're there, and just plan to have you sit at our table and just get caught up on your story. So if you're planning to do that, just go to the website. You find the link to the Cove. They usually end up filling out all the housing.
They do have housing there on campus there,
and so you really want to stay there if at all possible. And so it's always good to register early, because those seem to always end up getting filled up. And you can stay at hotels nearby, but it's better for the experience to stay right on site. Right.
Definitely. Okay, well, before the break, we saw sort of the people's side of Henry Ford and all the great things he was doing, but I suspect there's also a negative side to his leadership.
Ford was not well educated. He knew what he knew, but he didn't always know what he didn't know. And so a number of times he could be led astray by folks. He was not a really great reader, and so he would get impressed with someone without really critically necessarily analyzing what they were saying. And so Ford ended up having a number of things he became involved in that were embarrassing really to his legend himself. During World War I, he actually rented a ship, and he called it the Peace Ship, and he was going to just get a bunch of influential Americans and sail over to Europe and have a heart-to-heart with the Kaiser and bring an end to World War I, you know. And he at that point had enough success that it sort of went to his head. He just thought, hey, I'm a businessman.
I'm Henry Ford. They'll listen.
Yeah, we'll get, and that ended in a fiasco, as you could imagine. He bought a paper at one point to try to espouse a lot of his wisdom on things, and he revered the past, and so he was always trying to offer teaching counsel, whether it was on learning the old dance moves of his youth, or the old McGuffey readers that he grew up reading. He got in for a time there. He brought in some people that ended up leading him into some really strong anti-Semitism that was an ugly side to Ford. He got into beliefs about things like reincarnation for a while. Just a number of things that he could be led astray in, where he didn't really think through very well. And in a real famous incident, actually, in about 1919, the Chicago Tribune paper actually called him they kind of called him out, said, this guy's just an ignorant, naive, wealthy guy just because he's got lots of money. But he doesn't really know that much. And so Ford ultimately sued the paper for $1 million for libel. And because of that, he ended up having to go to court and be interviewed. And for about 8 days, Ford got on the stand. And basically, the opposing lawyer is trying to prove that he's ignorant. And so he asked him things like, well, what was America before it became a country, which they're thinking like colonies. He said, well, it was land before it became a country. And they said, well, when was it fashioned? And he thought it was formed in 1812. And I mean, it was just very clear that he just didn't know very much. I mean, even just basic things about, and yet he's moralizing and trying to teach Americans how they should think and what they should do. And basically they just made him look pretty foolish. And at a certain point, they just said, well, can we just give you a book and have you read it? Can you even read? And he just said, well, no. They said, if you don't read the book, then for us here in court, we'll have to assume that you don't know how to read. He said, well, that's fine. You can assume that. He said, I'm not a very fast reader, and so on. And so in court, they ultimately declared that he had won the case, but they only gave him 6 cents compensation, not $1 million.
Yeah.
And but the interesting thing was that it only made him more popular. It just made him look like these wealthy, high up papers, and
the elite were coming.
The elite
after
were coming down on this ordinary working man.
This poor, humble.
And so even though he's
Ford.
a multimillionaire, he comes out as people identified with him.
Yeah.
But he did a couple other things, just to maybe summarize, that were unfortunate. One is he had a pretty well-known affair with a woman about 30 years younger than him. It was one of those where his own wife sort of tolerated it. And in fact, he ultimately had the woman, his mistress, marry a security man, and bought the man a mansion right down the street from his own mansion, so he could have access to his mistress nearby.
Wow.
And ultimately, even when he died, the mistress and the wife were both there at his side as he died. Sort of some, here's a guy moralizing to other people about how to live, and yet had a long time mistress. And then probably the saddest thing as well was just that he didn't know what to do with his son, Edsel. And Edsel was much more sophisticated, much more educated, much more genteel, really a gentleman, which Ford was a lot more of a rough and tough kind of guy. And Ford just didn't know what to do with a gentleman's son. And he always thought Edsel just wasn't tough enough. And so he kept trying to toughen him up. And he just did some things that would humiliate his son. At one point, Edsel was going to build a new building at the Ford plant, and had already had the ground excavated, dug the hole for the foundation, and then Henry Ford just canceled it, just said, no, we don't need that. And then he wouldn't even let them fill in the hole that they had dug. They said, let's just leave the hole there for a while. And so every day Edsel would come to work and see this hole just as a reminder that his dad just nixed his initiative, his plan. And it was like Henry, in a misguided way, thought, well, I'll just sort of push my son until he fights back and he shows a backbone. But instead, it just broke his son's heart. And ultimately, his son died of stomach cancer at age 49. And a lot of it related just as well to stress and stomach problems from just the strain of working with his father all the time. And is one of the greatest tragedies in Ford's life, how he treated his son. And Ford became susceptible to people that would bring out the worst instincts in him. Harry Bennett became a tough guy. He was a security guard, basically, that knew how to stoke Ford's ego.
Yeah.
And so eventually there was some labor unrest at his Ford plant, and Harry Bennett just led a very brutal crackdown on the protesters, the strikers, in which several people were killed. And this idea of this enlightened, labor-friendly Henry Ford was tarnished severely.
Yeah.
And for several years, Bennett was just a thug that basically just took the aging Henry Ford around and just kind of led him to make some really poor decisions. And probably the last thing about Ford is that he just stayed around too long. He lived to be 84 years old and he should have just let go a lot longer.
Yeah.
In fact, he had a hard time letting go of the Model T car after it was already archaic and way out of date and losing terribly to the competition. Ford just had a hard time letting go of his greatest success, and people just kept pushing him to say, we've got to come up with something new. We got to be more customer friendly. Ford, so much success had gone to his head that he just kind of assumed he knew best, and that cost the company where they were overtaken by General Motors and so on, and so sadly the latter part of his life was spent oftentimes in great disarray, declining sales and morale at the company, losing all kinds of market share to competitors that were much more up to date and customer friendly and sensitive. And so ultimately his grandson, Henry Ford II, would come in and fire Bennett and take over the company, but only after it had lost significant ground. And so, like as you see so many of these people, they all have a real positive side, a real strong side to that makes them successful. But oftentimes the very thing that they're good at is also their Achilles heel. Yeah. And it's hard when you are successful, especially early on, then to walk away or to set that aside and say, now, what do we have to do next to continue being successful?
Yeah.
And so he's seen as perhaps one of the greatest business leaders in American history, certainly in the 20th century. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, there's lots and lots of flaws as well. And sadly, a guy that was in many ways, maybe an ordinary person that was suddenly thrust into the world limelight. And sometimes we lose sight of what makes us successful, and so Ford also just had a lot of negative things as well that kind of tarnished legacy. It's a very mixed legacy. Still very famous person in many ways, contributing things, but also feet of clay in many ways as well.
Yeah, well, there's a lot to learn from his legacy, from his life, and it's always fascinating to do these leadership profiles. And as always, we'll leave a link to the biography that you're drawing from for this, a link in the show notes for that. And I think we'll leave it there.
Great.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.